Welcome to Let's Get Writing. I'm Kathryn Mousseau. You know, when I thought about the idea for this series, I thought, well, there might be, maybe 6 people I can find who've written books, whom I can talk with. It's unbelievable, really, because once it started, every time I turned a page, so to speak, I would find another author, self-published, some of them with other publishing companies, and it continues and continues. So I'm so happy to share these adventures with you, and I hope if the book is in your heart that you'd like to write, that this series will help you get started and finish it. And today I'm really thrilled to have as my guest Dr. Dawn Hodder, and who is a native of Grand Falls, Windsor. Welcome to Let's Get Writing, Dr. Hodder. And we have your beautiful book on the table here, which is Follow Your Bliss, The Life and Times of a Family Doctor, which is you and is essentially your story. And that's what it is, isn't it?
It really is, yes. It's a legacy project for my family, my kids, my grandkids, my patients that I've had over the years, and maybe people who've never heard of me will enjoy it as well. Well,
you know, I think that's very true, because as I've been going through the book, I've been really engaged with it. And a lot of it, because you follow a very linear process somewhat through your life as you were young, and how you got, first you were quite active in your church, and then finally the path led to medicine. But your experiences growing up in Newfoundland, I think it would ring a chord with so many people.
I grew up on the south coast, a little community called Creston South, which is now part of the municipality of Marystown. But at the time that I was young, it was its own little community. Matter of fact, the year that I started school in 1945, there were 366 people in the town, and we had 80-something kids in the town, but we had 2 different schools because of the situation with the denominational system.
Mm-hmm.
And my first teacher actually grew up in Grand Falls. And I didn't know this until 60 years later. She contacted me one day, sent me a package with her pictures and pictures of my school,
mm-hmm.
and that sort of thing. And her name was Gladys Manuel.
Mm-hmm.
65 years later, I met her in Springdale as Mrs. Gladys Osmond, who was out there with others writing letters to people in the military in foreign countries. And she was leader of the Honorable Granny Brigade.
That's right, yeah. You mentioned
so
that.
My wife and I went to visit her. We had a real nice visit. And that was my first connection with Grand Falls. I did not know that eventually I would live here for 40 years.
Yeah, you were here for a long time as part of the medical community. And I think certainly that whole journey is reflected in your book. I found it really, really interesting, because so many people, such as yourself, came from small communities that were isolated, and then went on to do so many amazing things in their lives. And it's so great that you've put it in a book that people can read.
It really was a challenge. I was very fortunate. Matter of fact, I was the very first person in this school ever to matriculate and go on to university. And I ended up being the very first person from the municipality of Marystown to go to medical school. And I graduated in 1969 from Dalhousie University in Halifax.
And it's all in here for people to read about.
It's a wonderful journey.
Yeah, every time I've spoken to you, you've always said you've been very blessed in life.
I say in the preface to the book, I say, in the lottery of life, I was a major winner. And as I look back now, 60, 70 years later, if I could have developed that scenario, I can't see how I could have improved on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just been a wonderful experience. Now, we've all had our times when we had bad days, but have had a good life.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say here as well, as the Buddha said, contentment is the greatest wealth. So in that sense, I've been a very wealthy guy.
Nice. And you have many little phrases and quotes throughout the book, which I find are really interesting. And when I was reading, I'd stop and I'd think about that and I go, yeah, that's interesting, and how you integrated it into the book. And one of the reasons why we're doing this interview, well, I want to encourage people, of course, to read your book, but how did you start it? This is a big project. It's like over 400 pages, and you've never written a book before, so how did that come about?
Well, it's a long story. The very first thing that's written in this book that I wrote, I was 10 years old, maybe 12. And it's a little patriotic childlike poem that was actually published in the Sunday Herald, which was a forerunner of the Newfoundland Herald we have now, right? Mm-hmm. So there's 2 little verses there, and I remember that in my head. There's probably several other verses went with it, but I can't remember them.
You remembered those. I was impressed.
So over time, when I was 19, I wrote a poem for my mother for Mother's Day, and it was published in the Salvation Army War Cry, which is a church magazine. Mm-hmm. And that's included here in her eulogy that I wrote. That was a little more heavy poem, really. Mm-hmm. It was written in iambic pentameter, and it had an A-B rhyming way with it, and so on, right? And so people will read that, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, that's what we used to learn in school one time. I don't know if they do anymore, but we did do all those wonderful, those whatever, pentameters and the poetries and so on. But nowadays, I think it's a little more free-flowing. Not everyone is reading the classics in the same way. But this book, to me, in some way, is a classic. It's a picture of the history of Newfoundland, somewhat the history of our town, of places you went, and how life was as you grew up.
That's true. I left home when I was 15 years old. I just finished grade 11. And the ironic thing is that I was too young to go to university to learn how to teach. So they sent me teaching. And one of the stories I tell is how I ended up in Birchie Bay, just down in Notre Dame Bay. Had to come up the peninsula. I grew up in Burn Peninsula, so I had to come up the peninsula in a taxi and get a train in those days, because there was no Trans-Canada Highway. Mm-hmm. Ended up in Lewisport, got on a steamer in the middle of the night, and was dropped off in Birchie Bay. There was no wharf there big enough for the steamer to anchor at. So my 2 little suitcases was dropped on a rope down into a dory, and then I crawled down, or went down a rope ladder into the dory in the middle of the night, and that's where I stayed for a year.
That was one of your first adventures away from home as well, too, and you were so young. Then you had the responsibility of teaching and the whole thing. I mean, I even remember in the book when you said the first time when you went to St. John's, I believe, or on the way, you saw pavement, and you had to...
Yes, yes. First time I saw pavement was when I actually got off the train in Manuals, because I went there for a couple of months before I went to Birchie Bay. And we lived a pretty primitive life, essentially, where I grew up. One of the stories I tell is about going down New Gower Street one day with a friend of mine, and I saw bananas for the first time. And we bought one each. And I didn't know how to eat the banana. I started biting it, and he said, no, you gotta peel it away and eat the pulp inside.
We were an isolated province in some ways. I mean, you didn't know. It wasn't your fault. It's just the way it was. Bananas are not native to Newfoundland, and so...
No, there are no banana trees in my backyard. Huh?
No, and I kind of like the one when you impersonated a Portuguese sailor and played a little joke on one of the ladies in a restaurant.
That was in my first year of university. There was a guy, Bernard Fitzpatrick, and I. We were 16 years old, going to university, and at that time, the Portuguese fishing fleet that plied the waters off the Grand Banks for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. They would come into St. John's every now and then, and there'd be dozens of the ships around. And so these were young men like us with dark curly hair and dark sweaters on. So Bernard and I went down one day to Water Street, and all of a sudden we got an inspiration. Let's play Portuguese. So we went into Marty's restaurant, and we talked in an unknown tongue, and were taken to be Portuguese, and we played the part of stories in the book. And at the end, as we were leaving, we looked at the waitress and said, "Now that was some fun. Thanks a lot." We were naive and bad.
And bad. Well, that's a pretty low-key bad. You were having fun, but it showed again your youth and where you were and what you were doing and being away from home. When you started this, did you do an outline? Did you work from an outline, or did you just start writing? How did you approach it?
Well, a lot of the stuff I collected up over the years, many years. I was in the basement of our house there only recently, getting the Christmas decorations, and I found this box about that size. It was rather heavy. I had no idea what was in it. And there were literally many dozens of these little black notebooks. And that's where the notes came from. That was the foundation of this book. And so, although I've got a smartphone, I don't use it for that. Ideas come to my head. I always have a book, notebook.
And a pen.
And a pen. And I've got up at 4 o'clock in the morning sometimes, some idea comes in my head. Mark it down, because otherwise you will forget it.
They are elusive. At the time that you have them, you think, well, I'll remember that in the morning, but...
You remember that you had something to write down, but you forgot it. So that's why, even sometimes when my wife and I have been traveling, I would pass her the notebook and say, mark down this idea. And so that accumulated over many years. I've been very involved with the Kiwanis for 40 years, and there's a whole chapter here on Kiwanis International, which does, in time, we do the music festival, the Army Cadets, and breakfast programs, and some other stuff for the hospital pediatric ward, and so on. And a lot of the stuff that some quotes, poetry, doggerel, if you wish, that I wrote for friends of mine, and some limericks for members in Kiwanis when I was the bulletin editor. And that was a whole lot of fun. But so all that got put in the book too.
So somewhere, I mean, I'm going to call this journaling, because many times if you speak to people who write, they suggest the practice of journaling. So essentially, you were making notes.
I was making notes, but it wasn't a journal, because the next thing on my thing might be a list to go to Sobeys and get, you know, 3 items of something, right? It wasn't all profound and so on. It could have been, you might have had to read through, you know, many pages to get the next idea.
Okay, so did you have some idea when you were doing that somewhere, someday there might be a book?
That was my hope many years ago, yes. Probably for 10 years. It took me at least 10 years to get this accumulated and put together. A lot of it was typed up, some of it was typed up on a typewriter back. Matter of fact, the chapter on my philosophy of education is a summary, executive summary of a major dissertation I did when I did a BA in education back in 1964. So that was typed on a typewriter. So I had saved that. And because I retyped it and so on, but there we are.
There you are. So when you were doing this book, did you work with computer, longhand, combination thereof?
No, when I got it all going, by that time I had a computer, because I've had a computer for 20 years now. And I just did little chapters of this, little chapters of that. Actually, my daughter, who is a writer, said, "Dad, spit it out." She called it the vomit edition. You just say what comes in your head, right?
Yeah.
So I ended up with 150,000 words. And I spoke to the publisher, and he said, "That's a really large book. Can you cut it back?" So he said 90 to 120 is a good sized book. Most autobiographies are about 200 pages, give or take a bit. This is 462 pages. So it's 2 books actually.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, so people are getting this one, getting 2 for 1.
Well, but you still had to edit in there some. How many words now would be in there in total?
140,000 here now, so I took out 10,000 words.
Okay.
So I had many chapters more, but something got combined, and some more of them were just eliminated altogether.
Yeah, well, they say kill your darlings is one of the phrases.
Okay, I never
things
heard
that
that.
you think are fantastic.
Yes.
I've often heard that, kill your darlings. And there's something better underneath that. And so that's one of the things. Did you use inspiration from anyone as you began the process? Were there any books or any people you reached out to?
I think there are many people that one of the things I decided to do early on was to, at the beginning of each chapter, have a quote that had something to do with that chapter. As for example, in chapter 1, where I talk about my early education, I use a quote from Edgar Allan Poe, I think it is, or I forget now who it is, but it has to do with it. His education forms the common mind, just as the twig is bent, the tree is inclined. And that was a quote on my grade 11 graduation certificate. And Alexander Pope. And so the very first quote here is from the Bible. And actually, as it happened, I was at a funeral for a good friend of mine. And the minister started reading from the Old Testament. And he was reading from Job 19 and verse 23. Oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed in a book. And a light went on, and I said, that's a really good way to start my book. So it begins with a quotation. You know, many times I think as we're trying to write or get ourselves around a project like this, some such thing as what you've suggested, putting a quote there, whether it's there in the final version or not, but it's something that, it's almost like your anchor. Okay, here's where I'm going to begin, here's a focus for that chapter. And so on, so that may have been a very good tool for you. It was. I wrote a lot of stuff, and it was just basically just another document, another document, another document. I ended up with about 3 dozen of these. Then I tried to put them in an order, you know. So we did a chronological order, and basically, you know, to follow through. But a lot of it also is not a litany of events, you know. I was born, da 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 da, and now I'm an old man. It wasn't that. There's a lot of contemplations, sociological thoughts about that was happening at my time, in the time when I was a kid, and you know, life was pretty primitive, really. You know, we, for example, from healthcare, from social things that we have today. We had no electricity. I was long gone home before we had electricity.
Yes.
We had no indoor plumbing. You know, we had no town council. We had no garbage collection. People pretty well burned all their garbage in those days, and we certainly didn't have all the plastic they have today. So we had a sort of humble beginning, shall we say, you know. And but life has been good.
Yes.
For all this time.
Well, I find that in your story, I mean, there's so much. There's, I mean, layers and layers, and so much memory. I mean, just to recall all the things that you recall is quite remarkable in and of itself. Then to take it and put it in an order, and it flows so extremely well. Very, very nice book to read.
One of the things I say at the beginning, in the preface, is that, and studies have been done on this, what you think is absolutely true may not be the total truth, because there are certain biases that you have, certain things you think you remember, you heard your parents talk about. It's sort of like maybe a false memory, maybe it's a family story, and I've told several of these there, like the time my dad was building a school, and I was 5 years old, and I climbed up to the top of the roof. Did you read that?
I read that. Okay.
And so here I am, a little 5-year-old, up at the top of this ladder at the eve of a school roof that's being constructed. And so my dad was very smart. He didn't say, get down out of here. He said, come on. So he took me up, and he actually nailed my jacket onto the roof until I got bored. And then he just took me under his arm, took me out, and took me down.
Yeah.
So these are little stories that are, now I can't remember that, but it's sort of part of our family lore. Yeah, my brothers and my parents, when they were alive, they told those stories.
You also have some wonderful photographs in the book, and that allow us to really see, like your house. as it was when you lived there, and your house, I believe, currently is still there. When you
Yes.
from when you grew up.
My dad was a carpenter, and he actually spent a lot of his time building fishing skiffs. So he had a little sawmill, and he had a workshop where you could build these skiffs indoors. Sometimes he would have two at the go at one time, one outdoor one for good days and an indoor one for bad days, so he could build two skiffs at once. Anyway, and then we had a house that was built in 1952 when I was 13. I tell the story of how that was built. And so I went back home in probably 1960. I went out in the tickles, we call it, in the water, and a dory, and took a picture of this. And 50 years later, I took the same picture pretty well. And now you can see that the only thing remaining there is actually the house I grew up in. And now this has to do with resettlement. We were a receiving area for resettlement. We had about 2 acres of land where we grew vegetables and we kept animals. We had sheep and goats and chickens, lots of chickens. And we had to grow hay to feed them, because you know, if you didn't feed your animals in the wintertime, they'd die. So we had to do all that. Anyway, nowadays what happens, you look, nobody does that anymore. So in that 2 acres of land that we had, there's 16 families living there now.
Yeah.
So as my brother said, we lost our home to our place to resettlement, but in the opposite way to what most there's a big discussion out there now about resettlement. So I lost my home to resettlement, but in the opposite way to many, because Marystown became a resettlement focus, right?
Yes, it grew tremendously over those years.
It did, it did. From 1960 to 1990, it tripled in its population, but in the last 20 years, it's gone down a bit. In the census that was done in 2016, there was a little over 5,600 people there. So it's still the largest town on the south coast. Yeah.
Now, I very quickly, one of the stories I thought was so cute. You said you had the fences to keep the animals out so the hay could grow, so you could feed them in the winter.
Yes.
It was cute. It was different than what we perceive the fences to keep the animals in. But that was a way of living.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, you chose to self-publish your book.
Yes.
You are in control. And there's so many aspects, but self-publishing is a very, very popular way to go these days. How did you come to that decision?
Well, in trying to do things as well as I could, and I'm an obsessive compulsive person, so one of the things I wanted to know is, technically, if you're writing down somebody's 57 years old, should you write 5-7, or should you spell it out in letters, right? So I went looking for that, and I found it. And I know that there are different systems for this now. I didn't know that at the time. And that was on the internet, and I came across this publishing company called Friesen Press. And so I read about them, and then I phoned them, and we got a discussion, and next thing you know, we have a deal. That's a year and a half ago. So it's taken since about a year and a half to get this book on this table.
Well, they actually, and it's so funny because that's a company that I came across, and I really liked their package. I liked what they offered, the level of professionalism, and it is the same company that I'm working with as well. And part of the process with that, how fast you go through, is exactly where you are at the time, I guess, you contact them. But they do provide you with an editor. They provide you with copywriter for your back cover, and they help you through the artwork. Tell us a little bit about the title and the cover. We only have a lot of time left. We have a few minutes left, but I think it's important to touch upon that.
One of the things I've been interested in is comparative religion and mythology. There was a professor in the States, his name was Joseph John Campbell, and he wrote a lot of books on this. And one of the things he would tell his students was, look, out there for you, there is something that is going to turn your crank. And that's your bliss. You follow your bliss, and eventually you will be fulfilled, you'll be self-actualized, you will have a good life. So that's the title that I ended up with. Not the title I started with.
No?
No, but a lot of funny things. I had a whole pile of funny stories. And so my working title for a long time was A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Clinic. But one of my readers, I've had 6 people who were critiquers, if that's a word, he said to me, some of your stories are not funny at all. Why don't you choose another title? So now that funny thing, that's one of the chapters, a lot of the funny stories, because some of the stories are very sad. I've been in the arena of joy, and I have been in the arena of sorrow. Some people who read this book are going to laugh. I'd say most of them are going to laugh now and then, but occasional one with a sensitive soul is going to shed a tear. I've shed a tear even reading it for the umpteenth time.
And it's a heartfelt book. It no doubt is. And it covers many, many things. And it's a wonderful book to read. But the title is beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, Follow Your Bliss. And when you mentioned that, in particular, I do believe that's a very strong message we can send out to people today. If you're thinking of writing a book and you're not sure what to do, follow your bliss. Follow what idea you think you have passion about. Get that vomit copy out. Just get it out. Once you have something, it's like clay. You have something to work with. And look what can happen. Look where we are. Look at this great book. You're going to have a press conference coming up. There's a charitable component to this book. That people can see, and it's on the inside of the book. So much more, but there will be an event through the Health Foundation.
South and Sithron Health Foundation.
Yes.
They're going to sponsor a book launch.
Great. So that'll be out around the town. We'll promote that here on our show, and I just want to thank you so much for taking the time today to come in and talk to me about this.
This is perfect.
Thank you. I mean, we can hardly touch it, but I think hopefully we'll encourage people to want to read it and maybe also to write their own story.
Thank you.